The professor began his lecture in the University of North Carolina Auditorium, his tone brimming with confidence. It's time to move past the myths. Religion has held humanity back for centuries, and one of the biggest stories still dominating so many lives is Jesus. Let's be clear, Jesus is just a fairy tale. The students sat in silence, some nodding, others quietly taking notes. Michael Jordan, 62, the legendary basketball icon, was on campus as a guest speaker, addressing Gen Z's role in sports and culture, bringing his deep Christian faith and sharp competitive edge with him. But as he walked through the hallway, the professor's words reached his ears. Michael stopped, his hand clenching. Having faced NBA pressures and global fame, he was no stranger to controversy. Yet calling Jesus, the foundation of his faith and values, a fairy tale was something he couldn't let stand. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Professor Samuel Whittaker, a renowned progressive scholar, stood at the podium, hands braced on the desk, his sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd of students in the University of North Carolina Auditorium. And now, he continued his lecture with unwavering confidence. "Look at the facts," he said, his voice low but cutting like a knife. "The story of Jesus Christ, a man said to walk on water, turn water into wine, rise from the dead, is no different from Greek mythology or Viking legends. There's no reliable historical evidence confirming he existed as the Bible claims. It's all a product of imagination woven to control the masses for centuries." The students remained quiet, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in discomfort. A girl in the front row scribbled notes quickly while a guy in the corner discreetly scrolled on his phone. Whittaker smirked smugly, relishing the attention. "I know this is hard for some of you to hear," he went on, "but it's time we grow up and leave childish stories behind. Science and reason are the only path to progress. Religion, especially the Jesus myth, is just baggage from the past." He paused, letting his words sink into the air as if expecting applause, but instead, the door clicked open again. Michael Jordan stood there, his tall, commanding figure in a sleek black jacket, his eyes blazing like an unquenchable fire. The students turned, murmuring excitedly, "Who's that? Isn't that MJ, the Bulls legend?" Whittaker frowned, tilting his head slightly, clearly displeased at the interruption. Michael took a deep breath, stepping forward, his shoes tapping on the wooden floor like a wordless declaration of war. He stopped in the aisle, staring straight at the professor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm, echoing through the room. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just heard you say Jesus is a fairy tale, and I have to say you're wrong." The auditorium held its breath. Whittaker raised an eyebrow, a smirk flickering across his lips. "Oh, and who might you be?" he replied, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I didn't expect a retired athlete to care about my history class. Are you here to defend this myth?" Michael didn't flinch. He stepped onto the podium, standing a few feet from Whittaker, arms crossed confidently, the stance of a champion used to facing tough opponents. "I'm not here to defend a myth," he said, his voice sharp as a blade slicing through the air. "I'm here to defend the truth. You say there's no evidence for Jesus. Then how do you explain Tacitus, a non-Christian Roman historian who recorded Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate, or Josephus, a first-century Jew who mentioned Jesus as a real figure with major influence? This isn't the Bible. These are independent historical sources." The students began whispering, some pulling out phones to look it up. Whittaker crossed his arms, his smirk still intact. "You, Jordan, right," he said coolly. "You might be a legend in basketball, but don't bring your game into my classroom. Those sources, if they're even real, are just fragmented anecdotes written decades after the fact. They prove nothing beyond someone telling a good story." Michael tilted his head, a spark of defiance flashing in his eyes. "A good story," he repeated, his voice rising with sarcasm. "Then why did that story change the world? Why have billions across centuries lived and died for it? You can call it a fairy tale, but you can't deny Jesus' impact, historical or religious. Take your pick." Dismissing him entirely isn't science, it's arrogance. The room buzzed. One student clapped, then stopped awkwardly. All eyes turned. Whittaker's lips twitched, clearly prepared for such a strong counter. "Who do you think you are, Mr.
Jordan?" he asked, his voice hardening. "A theologian? A historian? Or just a celebrity with outdated ideas?" Michael smiled, but it held no warmth. "I'm someone who believes in truth," he replied, his voice steady as steel. "And the truth is, you just insulted millions, including me, by calling Jesus fiction without a strong enough argument. If you want a debate, I'm ready." The University of North Carolina Auditorium turned into an arena.
Professor Samuel Whittaker stood at the podium, arms crossed, his icy gaze fixed on Michael Jordan. The students filled the seats, eyes wide, some already filming with their phones, unwilling to miss a moment. Michael, towering in his sleek black jacket, stood firm in the aisle, unfazed by his stare. The air was taut, waiting for a spark to ignite it. Whittaker broke the silence, his voice dropping thick with sarcasm. "Mr.
Jordan, you think you can just waltz in here and lecture me? You believe a few scraps from Tacitus or Josephus make Jesus real? How disappointing from someone who claims to be informed." He shook his head as if scolding a naive child. Michael's lips twitched, his eyes flashing with defiance.
"Disappointing?" he echoed, his tone rising with mockery. "I don't need you to know who I am to say you're wrong. You think dismissing anything that doesn't fit your rational box is clever? No, I'm standing here for what I believe, what my family, my Christian faith and history have taught me. Jesus isn't just a name in a book, he was real, and you can't deny that just because you don't like it." The students stirred, whispers rising. Whittaker let out a dry laugh, but it couldn't mask his irritation. "Oh, Christian faith," he said, dripping with mockery. "Is that the armor you're in here? I suppose being a sports icon forces you to cling to fairy tales for justification, but let's be honest, Mr. Jordan, do you really believe he walked on water, turned water into wine, rose from the dead? Is that what you want these students to buy into?" He gestured to the room as if inviting them to join in ridiculing him. Michael took a deep breath, staying calm but his eyes blazing. "I'm not here to force anyone to believe in miracles," he replied, his voice steady but unyielding. "That's a personal choice. But I'm here to say, calling Jesus pure fiction is flat out wrong. You want sources? Tacitus recorded the execution under Pilate. Josephus mentioned Jesus as a real figure leading a major movement. This isn't legend, it's history. You don't have to believe he's the Son of God, but denying he existed, that's willfully blinding yourself to the truth." Whittaker crossed his arms, tilting his head, the smirk returning. "History, you say? Scattered anecdotes written by people who saw nothing, decades after it all ended. You call that evidence? I call it hearsay, inflated by a fanatic mob. You seem smart, Mr. Jordan, but clearly you'd rather swallow what's shoveled at you than analyze it." His words struck like a dagger. Michael stood taller, his gaze locked on him. "Analyze?" he said, his voice lowering but brimming with power. "That's why I'm here. I don't swallow anything. I grew up in a Christian family in North Carolina, played basketball to build grit, and learned to see truth through both reason and heart. You can mock my faith, but you can't erase Jesus's impact, not just on me, but on billions who've lived by his teachings." A male student in the middle row raised his hand, voice hesitant. "Mr.
Jordan, what do you mean by impact? Do you actually believe the miracle stuff?" The room turned to him, waiting. Michael gave a small, genuine smile, the first in the debate. "Thanks for the question," he said, his tone warming. "I believe in the power of Jesus's ideas. Love, forgiveness, sacrifice, miracles. That's up to you, but don't let anyone tell you he didn't exist. He changed how we live, how we build societies. That's fact, not fairy tale."
Whittaker laughed loudly, no longer hiding his frustration. "Ideas, huh? You're turning a fictional figure into a symbol to prop up your public image. I know this game. You learned it from your fame, didn't you? Using emotion to override reason, but here in this classroom, we deal in facts, not sappy feelings. Michael tilted his head, his eyes sharp as a blade. Facts? He asked, his voice rising with defiance. The fact is, you just insulted me and millions by calling Jesus fiction without an argument beyond your own arrogance. You say I use emotion. Fine, I'm human, not a robot, but don't get it twisted. My case rests on history, not feelings. You dismiss everything that doesn't fit your worldview. Is that reason or just stubbornness? The room erupted in murmurs. A girl in the front clapped, then stopped as Whittaker glanced over. Another guy shouted, "He's got a point." Whittaker's fists clenched, his face reddening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by an outsider barging into his class. "You want to argue emotions?" he snapped. "Fine, but keep your celebrity status and superstitions out of my classroom." Michael took another step closer to the podium, his eyes never leaving him. "I didn't bring celebrity here," he said, his voice solid as steel. "I brought truth, something you seem to have forgotten how to face. If you want to keep going, I'm game." The students' whispers rose like waves, phones held high, capturing every second. Professor Samuel Whittaker stood at the podium in the University of North Carolina Auditorium, fists clenched, face flushed with anger. Michael Jordan, towering but formidable in his sleek black jacket, stood a few steps away, his piercing gaze unflinching. The debate had spiraled beyond academics into a clash of arrogant reason and steadfast faith. Whittaker took a deep breath, trying to regain composure, but his voice still trembled with frustration. "You call me stubborn, mister." "Jordan," he growled, pointing at him, "I've spent my life studying history, analyzing sources, while you, a retired man who's just a sports star, dare lecture me on truth. You think a few scraps from Tacitus and Josephus are enough to make me bow to your Jesus? Ridiculous. You walk into my class with this confidence, but your fame and superstitions have blinded you." Michael tilted his head, a faint smile crossing his lips, but devoid of friendliness. "Blinded?" he asked, his voice dropping with defiance. "No, I'm standing here because I see the truth, one you refuse to accept. I don't need to be your student to know dismissing anything outside your rational box is a mistake. I grew up in a Christian family in North Carolina, learned to question and dig deep because I don't settle for easy answers, and now I'm here, not for fame or superstition, but for the truth history has proven." The students sat silent, holding their breath. Whittaker let out a dry laugh, but it rang hollow, lacking confidence. "Your truth," he sneered. "Your truth is a story spun by a fanatic mob, used by you and people like you to manipulate emotions. You say Jesus changed the world? Sure, I won't deny the myth's influence, but influence isn't proof of existence. Hitler influenced the world too. Does that make him a god?" Michael took another step, his eyes blazing. "Don't compare Jesus to Hitler," he said, his voice like steel. "That's a cheap trick, and you know it. Jesus taught love and forgiveness. Hitler brought death and destruction. But if you want to talk about influence, look at the laws, morals, and society we live in. Where did those values come from? From Jesus's teachings, a real person, not a fiction. You may not believe he's the Son of God, but don't pretend he didn't leave a mark deeper than anyone in history." Whittaker crossed his arms, his eyes flashing with anger. "You really are a showman," he said, his voice icy. "All flashy words, no substance. You think those cliches will sway anyone here? These students are smarter than that. They want truth, not feelings." He turned to the crowd, waving a hand. "Tell me, do you believe him or science?" A female student in the middle row raised her hand, her voice hesitant. "But if there are documents mentioning Jesus, doesn't that prove he was real?" Another guy jumped in. "Yeah, Tacitus wasn't Christian. Why would he make it up?" Whispers spread, a few nodding in agreement. Whittaker spun back, his face redder. "Those documents aren't reliable," he snapped. "They were written too late, possibly forged, or just rumors. You want to believe rumors? That's not science, that's naivety." He pointed at Michael. "And you prey on that naivety, just like you did with fans. I expected someone walking in here to bring a better argument." His words struck Michael's pride. He stepped onto the podium, level with Whittaker, his voice low but powerful, like crashing waves. Expected? He asked. You expect everyone to just agree with you, dismissing anything that doesn't suit you? I'm not naive, Professor. I learned from life, and life taught me truth isn't just in your books. I grew up building resilience through basketball, and I know how to see truth with both reason and heart. Whittaker stepped back half a pace, caught off guard by his intensity. You think your personal story makes you right? He growled. I don't care how you grew up. I care about evidence, real evidence, not the fragmented anecdotes you keep repeating. Michael smiled, this time a victorious one. Real evidence? He asked. You want evidence? Look at history. Without Jesus, do you think we'd have hospitals, schools, or the concept of human rights? Those didn't just appear. They came from his teachings. You can call them anecdotes, but I call them the foundation of our world. The students erupted in applause, no longer shy. A girl shouted, "He's right!" Another guy raised his phone. I just looked it up. Tacitus is real. Whittaker clenched his fists, his lips tightening into a line. He wasn't used to the crowd turning on him, especially from a guest barging into his class. You're good at polishing yourself, he said, his voice dropping with bitterness, but don't expect me to buy into this performance. You might fool them, but you won't fool me. Michael looked him straight in the eye, fearless. I don't need to fool anyone, he replied. The truth speaks for itself. I'm standing here for what I believe, and I won't stay silent just because you won't listen. Michael Jordan stood on the podium in the University of North Carolina Auditorium, his eyes shining, towering but commanding in his sleek black jacket. Professor Samuel Whittaker, a renowned progressive scholar, now stood still, gripping the edge of the lectern, his gaze flickering between anger and confusion. For the first time in the debate, he didn't respond immediately. The crowd leaned toward Michael, phones held high, recording. Some students even standing to cheer, and Whittaker sensed he was losing ground. Michael took a deep breath, his voice lowering but still resonating. If you see that as a loss, maybe the problem isn't me, it's how you view truth. His words were a final blade, not harsh but sharp, leaving a heavy silence in the room. The students kept whispering, some nodding in agreement, others watching Whittaker for a reaction. Whittaker opened his mouth, but this time no words came out. He turned away, his eyes dropping to the worn wooden floor, as if searching for an answer in its scratched lines. In his mind, he had no memory of Michael. He was a guest who'd walked into his class, an unexpected opponent, but he wondered, did I miss something? Was I wrong to shut my mind to what can't be measured? He'd spent a lifetime studying history with cold reason, but now Michael's conviction made him pause. Michael didn't let the silence linger. He turned to the crowd, his voice warmer but still powerful. I'm not here to force you to believe Jesus is the Son of God, he said, scanning the students' faces. That's your choice. But I'm here to say completely dismissing him, calling him a fairy tale, is dishonest. Science doesn't explain all of humanity. History isn't just data, it's ideas, people who changed how we live. Jesus was one of them. He was real, and he matters. A male student in the back raised his hand, voice curious. But if science can't prove miracles, why do you still believe? Michael smiled, this time sincerely. Good question, he replied. I believe because I see the power in his teachings. Love, forgiveness, sacrifice. I grew up with them, live them every day. Miracles. That's up to you, but don't let anyone tell you he didn't exist just because we can't measure everything. Whittaker looked up, his gaze no longer harsh but thoughtful. Michael's words echoed in his mind, stirring a buried memory. He recalled his early days as a scholar when he was more open, reading the Bible not to debunk but to understand. When had he changed? When he decided reason was everything, that anything unmeasurable was illusion. He looked at Michael, and for the first time he saw not a naive fool, but a man who'd found something bigger, something he might have lost. The students grew lively. A girl in the front stood, voice excited. I agree with him. If Jesus wasn't real, why did the whole world change because of him? Another guy cut in. But if it's just influence, why argue? Hitler had influence too. Michael turned to him, his eyes stern. Don't repeat that cheap comparison, he said. Hitler destroyed. Jesus built. His influence is the foundation of the best in us. That's the difference. Whittaker frowned but didn't counter right away. He stepped aside, hand resting on the desk as if needing support to think. Am I really being honest? He wondered. He'd spent a lifetime denying Jesus. But now, facing Michael's arguments and the students' support, he felt a crack in his wall of arrogance. He looked at him, his voice lowering for the first time, free of sarcasm. You say science doesn't explain all of humanity, he said slowly. But if we don't rely on science, what do we rely on? Emotion, faith. Is that what you want the students to learn? Michael nodded, his eyes steady on him. I want them to learn to think for themselves, he replied. Science is a great tool. I respect it, but it's not everything. Faith, history, emotion. They're part of being human too. I didn't need you to teach me to question to know not every answer comes from a lab. Jesus doesn't need a test tube to prove he was real. He proved it through what he left behind. The students erupted in applause again, some shouting, He's right. Whittaker stood there, his hand trembling slightly. He looked around, seeing young faces watching him with a different look. Not blind awe, but curiosity, challenge. He wondered, have I been too rigid? Did I miss something he sees? The students couldn't sit still. Some stood, phones raised, recording, whispers spreading like waves. The debate had peaked, and the tense air now turned to uncontainable excitement. Michael took a deep breath, turning to the crowd, his voice ringing warm and strong. You're Gen Z, the future I've inspired, he said, his gaze sweeping over their young faces. I'm not here to force you to believe anything. I just want you to think for yourselves. Jesus, he's not a fairy tale. He's part of history, part of what made us. He was real, and he matters. You want to dismiss him? Fine, but do it with truth, not arrogance. And if you want to ask more, I'm always game, here or on X. He winked, adding a playful flair, making some students laugh and clap loudly. Michael stepped off the podium, not to leave but to stand closer to the crowd. He raised a hand to quiet them, his voice lowering but magnetic. I don't need you to agree with me, he said. I just want you to question, like I did. He glanced at Whittaker, a look not of hostility but subtle respect. Michael reminded him of his early teaching days when he urged students to challenge everything, not just accept his words. He wondered, when did I close my mind? He looked at him, and for the first time he saw not an adversary, but someone reminding him why he once loved this job. The students didn't notice Whittaker's silence. They were too caught up with Michael. A guy in the back yelled, "You should coach here!" Another girl raised her phone. I'm posting this on X right now. Michael wins! Laughter rang out, and Michael smiled, shaking his head slightly. Thanks, he said, his tone tinged with humor. But I like my retirement better, less arguing with professors. The crowd laughed again, the mood lightening, but their respect for him remained clear. Whittaker finally spoke, his voice low and slow, no longer sharp. Are you done, Mr. Jordan? He asked, his gaze on him carrying subtle curiosity, not enmity. Michael turned, nodding. I'm done, he replied. But I hope you're not. I hope you'll rethink what I said. His words weren't an attack, but an invitation, a gentle yet meaningful challenge. Whittaker didn't answer right away. He turned to the crowd, his voice quieter than usual. Class ends here today, he said, then stepped off the podium, grabbing his briefcase. The students were surprised, some whispering, did he give up? But Whittaker hadn't given up. He just needed time. He glanced at Michael one last time, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, though he didn't voice it. Michael stood amid the crowd, a few students surrounding him with questions. How do you stay so calm? A girl asked. I'm not always calm, Michael laughed. Another guy cut in. Do you think the professor will change his mind? Michael looked toward Whittaker, now near the door. I hope so, he said. He's a smart man. I just want him to reconsider. As Whittaker left the auditorium, he paused in the hallway, gripping his briefcase tightly. He heard the students still cheering behind him, Michael answering them with seasoned energy. He gave a faint smile, the first of the day. He wouldn't admit defeat, but he knew he'd been shaken. He'd go back to his office, reopen old history books, reread the passages on Tacitus and Josephus he'd once dismissed, not to agree with Michael, but to understand, to question, like he'd once urged his students to do. Michael left the auditorium a few minutes later, the crowd of students still buzzing around him. To the door, he stepped into the sunlight, breathing the fresh North Carolina campus air. He felt relieved, not from winning, but from defending what he believed. Not just for himself, but for people like him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, notifications from X and TikTok, students already spreading the debate video.
Meanwhile, the buzz from the auditorium lingered. Students gathered in clusters, talking excitedly. He was amazing, one said. The professor didn't stand a chance, another added. The TikTok video racked up hundreds of views in minutes, the Michael wins spreading fast.
Michael Jordan walked off the University of North Carolina campus, sunlight filtering through the trees, illuminating his sleek black jacket. The students' cheers still echoed from the auditorium behind. But now he felt the calm of victory, not over Whittaker, but for standing up for what he believed. His phone buzzed non-stop, X and TikTok notifications flooding with Michael wins. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. Gen Z moves fast, he thought, picturing students filming and sharing the story in mere minutes. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a viral moment. It was something bigger. Meanwhile, Professor Samuel Whittaker stepped into his small office in the corner of the faculty building. He closed the door, the noise from the hallway fading, leaving him with a heavy silence. He set his briefcase on the desk, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled out his chair. His gaze fell on the bookshelf behind him, thick history books, documents he'd studied for decades. He recalled Michael's words, "Jesus doesn't need a test tube to prove he was real. He proved it through what he left behind." Those words were like a needle, not painful but deep enough to make him pause. Whittaker sighed, pulling an old book from the shelf, a copy of Tacitus's writings he'd once dismissed as unreliable. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing the Latin lines. He'd once thought these records were mere rumors, but now he wondered, if it's not true, why has it endured through time? Why does a myth have such power? He wasn't ready to admit Michael was right, but he couldn't deny one thing. He made him doubt himself, something no one had done in years. Outside, the ripple from the debate began to spread. A student TikTok video titled, "Basketball Legend Takes Down Professor," had racked up thousands of views in just half an hour. On X, the Michael wins was trending locally with lively comments. Sports fans speaking up, some criticized him, calling him a mouthpiece for superstition, but most praised his confidence and sharp reasoning. Michael wasn't surprised. He was used to division from his NBA days, but this time felt different. He wasn't just representing sports, but a legacy.
Michael paused by a wooden bench on campus, sitting down to check his phone. He opened TikTok, seeing a flood of comments. "He's right about Jesus. I'm not religious, but he makes me want to learn more." He smiled, replying to one briefly, "Thanks. Keep asking. I'll answer." Then he texted his wife, "Today was wild, but I'm okay. How's the family?" The reply came instantly, "Kids are fine. You did great. Tell me later."
He stared at the screen, thinking of his grown children and grandchildren at home. Someday I'll tell them about standing up for what's right, he thought, his heart warming. In his office, Whittaker still sat there, the book open before him. The arrogance of the morning was gone. Michael's argument made him wonder, do I really understand everything? He grabbed a pen, scribbling on a paper, Tacitus, Josephus, cultural impact. He didn't know where these notes would lead, but for the first time in years, he wanted to explore, not to debunk, but to understand. As Michael left campus, his phone rang, a call from his manager. "Michael, the debate video is going viral," the manager said excitedly. "Everyone wants you on air tonight to talk about it." He nodded over the phone. "Fine," he said, "but I'll do it my way. No script." He hung up, got into his car, his eyes fixed ahead. He knew this wasn't just another day. It was a milestone, a story he'd carry throughout his legacy. In his office, Whittaker looked out the window, watching Michael's figure disappear behind the trees. He gave a faint smile, not from defeat, but because, for the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity return. He turned back to his desk, opening another book, this time on religion's influence on Western civilization. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but he was ready to read, ready to question. Michael Jordan sat in his car, the sunset painting the road ahead gold as he left the University of North Carolina campus. His phone notifications kept buzzing. The debate video had now surpassed tens of thousands of views. Michael wins spreading across X and TikTok. He hadn't just defended Jesus as a real historical figure. He'd sparked a bigger conversation about faith, history, and Gen Z's power. Meanwhile, Professor Samuel Whittaker remained in his office, the Tacitus book open before him, his gaze pensive. The debate wasn't just an event, it was a turning point, leaving a profound lesson for all. For Michael, today proved the past could inspire the future. He'd shown faith and reason weren't enemies. They were two arms lifting humanity up. From the auditorium to social media, he inspired a young generation to question, explore, and hold fast to what they believe. Whittaker, a once arrogant progressive scholar who dismissed anything unmeasurable, now sat with a new spark of curiosity. He didn't change instantly, but a seed of doubt had sprouted. A lesson that truth doesn't always lie in what he could control. The students, witnesses to it all, left the auditorium with broader minds. Some looked up Tacitus and Josephus, others posted the debate video to discuss with friends. They didn't just hear a showdown, they saw a 62-year-old basketball legend blend history, emotion, and timeless style to challenge a stranger's worldview. That was the biggest lesson. Standing up for what you believe doesn't need a script or power, just truth and courage. Michael gazed out his car window, thinking of his family. He wanted them to know history, and faith weren't things to discard. They were foundations to build on. Whittaker, in his office, closed his book, a faint smile on his lips. He wrote a short line on paper, question like he did. He'd never known Michael before, but he'd made him rethink. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he was ready to start. The story of Michael Jordan facing off with Professor Whitaker at the University of North Carolina mirrors the tensions and opportunities in today's American society. A nation polarized between scientific reason and traditional values, between older generations and an energetic Gen Z. In today's context, as debates about religion, history, and cultural identity explode on platforms like X and TikTok, much like the Michael Wins video spread, this story isn't just an academic exchange, but a reflection of how Americans confront differences. Michael, with his Tacitus and Josephus-backed case for Jesus as a historical figure, represents seasoned icons striving to preserve a faith heritage in an increasingly secular society. Conversely, Whittaker, with his initial arrogance and later self-reflection, mirrors a segment of American intellectuals who sometimes dismiss the past without full consideration. The takeaway here is practical. In today's America, don't slam the door on differing views. Listen and see question, like Michael did with the students, or like Whittaker ultimately relearned from him. When he invited people to discuss on TikTok, he showed the power apparition of openness and connection, something Americans can use to bridge political or cultural divides. For Whittaker, reopening Tacitus post-debate is a reminder that even the most confident should be willing to reconsider, a vital attitude in an information-saturated age. Take Michael's example, stand up for what you believe, like his defense of Christian faith and history, but do it with truth and courage, not just emotion. In a contentious America, from elections to religious freedom debates, this lesson encourages each person to find balance between conviction and openness, turning conflict into a chance to understand one another better. Thanks for following Michael's journey to defend the truth. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. See you in the upcoming video, where we'll keep questioning and exploring what makes America today.